In this video, we're going to talk about chlorination and bromination of alkanes. This is going to be a quick introduction, and then you can see a little bit later on topic 4 here, we're going to go into these reactions in a lot more detail. If we have cyclohexane and we add Cl2, we don't see any reaction at all. However, if we add a little bit of light, and you'll notice we also need a little bit of heat here, we can replace a hydrogen with a chlorine. This is a fascinating reaction because carbon-hydrogen bonds on sp3 hybridized carbons are, for the most part, unreactive. So what's happening here? This process goes through highly reactive free radicals. You can see that this is not a selective reaction in terms of stereochemistry, so we're going to see both enantiomers formed. We can do these reactions with Cl2 or Br2. We don't really see F2 reactions or I2 reactions, and we'll talk about why that is later. So let's get into the mechanism of these reactions and try to understand why these are happening and why we're getting the products that we're getting. Chlorination and bromination occur via what we call a chain reaction mechanism. So you can see in this first step, an initiation step. This is where we are forming the free radicals. Cl2 is split by light into two Cl radicals. So you can see over here we have the chlorine-chlorine bond, and one electron goes to one chlorine, and the other electron goes to the other chlorine. And so those are our two chlorine radicals. Once we have the chlorine radicals, these radicals are going to propagate. This next step is known as a propagation step. And we can see chlorine over here forming a bond to the hydrogen. And we can see the carbon-hydrogen bond breaking to give a methyl radical. Hopefully, this looks a little bit familiar to you. This is an SH2 step or a hydrogen abstraction. Remember that SH2 stands for bimolecular homolytic substitution. Our last step, which is a termination step in that we're terminating the chain, also is a radical coupling step, where we have two radicals coming together to form a species with no radicals. So we can see chlorine radical coming over here to donate one of the electrons in the carbon-chlorine bond. And the other electron, this blue electron here, comes from methyl radical. So this is generally how we would draw out this mechanism. We have our initiation step where Cl2 splits, the chlorine-chlorine bond breaking in a homolytic cleavage with one electron going to one chlorine and forming Cl radical, and the other electron going to the other chlorine and forming another Cl radical. After that step, we have a propagation step in our chain reaction where the chlorine radical that we formed is now going to do a hydrogen atom abstraction with methane. And we can see this reaction here where chlorine radical is forming a bond with that hydrogen over there. The green electron comes from chlorine, and the blue electron comes from the hydrogen-carbon bond. The other electron of the hydrogen-carbon bond goes on the carbon to form methyl radical, and then the last step is our termination of the chain reaction mechanism, or a radical coupling step. And we can see chlorine radical and methyl radical here in blue coming together to form a chlorine-carbon bond. Now, this isn't necessarily the only mechanism that is going to form a chlorinated product, but it is a reasonable one. So this chain reaction that we went through consists of the initiation, propagation, and termination steps. Let's go and look at some of these steps in a little bit more detail and see what other mechanisms are possible. Here's our initiation step, and we already went over this, but we said that light was used to break our chlorine-chlorine bond, giving 1 electron to each chlorine and forming 2 chlorine radicals. Initiation can also occur with a little bit of heat to cleave that chlorine-chlorine bond. Initiation steps typically tend to produce free radicals. So if we have something that doesn't have radicals forming something that does, we usually call that an initiation step. Here are some examples of propagation steps. We already looked at the top one, our hydrogen atom abstraction, or SH2 reaction. However, there are other possible propagation reactions that can occur. You can see this bottom one, where we have a methyl radical reacting with chlorine to break the chlorine-chlorine bond and form a chlorinated species. So this is another way that we can get to that same product. Notice that with our propagation steps, they are continuing the radical chain reaction. Additionally, our propagation steps are typically going to involve reactions like the SH2 mechanism or radical addition to an alkene or alkyne. So those are the types of things that we're seeing happening in propagation steps of the radical chain reaction. Termination of the radical chain reaction happens when we have radical couplings. And you can see here a number of possible radical couplings for this particular reaction. We have 2 chlorine radicals coming together to form chlorine. Now, of course, this isn't going to get us anywhere in the mechanism, but it is a possible termination step that can occur. Termination means ending the radical chain reaction. Here's another one, and this is the one that we went over where we have chlorine radical and methyl radical coming together to form a chlorinated product. However, you could also get methyl radical reacting with methyl radical and forming ethane. So it's another possible side reaction that could occur. We see that termination steps end the radical chain reaction or stop it, and these steps involve radical coupling.